Ben. This is my real role, is cinema usher. Welcome everybody, my name is Ray Perman and I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and welcome to the third in our series of politicians and professionals. And again, we're very grateful for the support of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and Alan Watson from the Institute and Faculty is chairing the Q&A this evening. The Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, and the Young Academy of Scotland. And as in previous events, Stuart Reid from the Young Academy is going to say something about their work right at the end of the proceedings. This evening we have Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, to speak to us. The Conservatives had a very good election a year ago in May 2016, more than doubling the number of seats in the Scottish Parliament to 31, overtaking the Labour Party and so becoming the official opposition in the Scottish Parliament, the second largest party in the Parliament. Ruth campaigned for Remain in the European referendum, but has since wholeheartedly supported her leader in her negotiations over Brexit. Is that fair, Ruth?
I think it's more nuanced than that.
More nuanced than that. I'm not very good at nuance, I'm sorry about that. I'm going now to hand over, in case I do anything else wrong, I'm going to hand over to Ruth Davidson. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And good evening, and thank you all very much for inviting me once again to come to this evening and to talk with you. I'm honoured, as always, to speak at the David Hume Institute as part of this regular series, and I congratulate the Institute and the Young Academy for keeping it going. Of course, it's always beholden on speakers like me to start by saying how vital your work is and how it's never been more important. But the truth is that your work is vital, and it really has never been more important. The political soundbites of early 2017 sum up where public life is right now: post-truth, alternative facts, and fake news. We're at, I believe, an unsettling moment where it appears that choosing to believe things, or at least having enough social media shares, makes them so. And it means that the mission of organisations such as the David Hume Institute to seek out actual evidence and the actual facts has rarely seemed more necessary or more urgent. So I'd like to thank you for the work that you do. And I would urge this organisation to step up its determination to remain faithful to the facts. For my part, I promise this evening to refrain from claiming that there are far more people here in tonight's audience than there were for Patrick Harvey last week. Bigly, with my little hands, even if there are. So tonight's speech is entitled "A Scottish Government with the Powers to Act." It's about a government here in Scotland that needs to take control. And control is one of those other words that we've heard a lot about in the last 12 months, specifically about taking it back. Frankly, I feel like it's a word that's dogged politics this last year, and it's certainly dogged me. But this evening I want to reflect on how we in Scotland must now take control ourselves of this moment and turn away from the politics of uncertainty and division that we've seen afflict us for far, far too long. Before I develop that point, however, let me begin by saying a few words on where I think we stand in Scotland right now. Quite obviously, it's right to say, first of all, that we're in a very different place to the rest of the United Kingdom. It was something that came home to me very clearly last year when I campaigned in that European referendum. Not just because Scotland voted with Northern Ireland and differently to England and Wales, but more fundamentally, it was clear that Scotland and the rest of the UK were operating on different timelines. The rest of the UK was taking part in a play that it thought was brand new, while here in Scotland, we were already familiar with all of the lines. The labelling of inconvenient facts as Project Fear. Yes, we remembered that one. Tub-thumping calls to seize our Independence Day. Yep, that one too. And the whole agonising business of watching political debate retreat into a tribal contest over identity. It was déjà vu all over again. For people in England and Wales, I know that all of this felt exciting and epoch-defining, and for many, it may even have felt exhilarating. For many of us in Scotland, however, I suspect it was an unwelcome revisiting of something we'd been trying to get past. Unlike the rest of Britain, we've now had nearly 10 years of constitutional issues dominating our political debate. 10 years where the existential questions of who we are and what country we want to be have predominated. And my hunch is simply that many people in Scotland have had enough, and that partly explains why the campaign itself was far more muted up here than it was elsewhere, why it felt like someone else's war. We'd had our referendum. And more fundamentally, it also explains the reaction in Scotland to the Brexit result in June of last year, a reaction that wasn't expected. The SNP had anticipated a massive surge of support for independence if, as happened, Scotland voted to remain, while the UK as a whole opted to leave. Nicola Sturgeon predicted in April of last year that such would be the backlash, that support for another independence referendum would rocket. Certainly for a few weeks in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, it looks as if she might be right. But now, 7 months on, even the First Minister would have to admit that it hasn't happened, and at least I would hope that she would choose to do so. Now, I don't think for a moment that this is because people in Scotland on June the 24th suddenly decided they were all huge fans of Brexit after all. I doubt that very much. I think it is largely because, after 10 years of constitutional division, people look at the prospect of yet more uncertainty over the future and they think no thanks. Now, I repeat, I am categorically not saying that Scotland has converted to becoming cheerleaders for the prospect of our leaving the European Union. I simply make the point that most people do not want our departure from the European Union and all the division that brings to trigger another referendum on our own Union of Nations with all the divisions that that brings too. Now, they include unionists who believe that the question on our future was answered for good in 2014 and shouldn't be returned to. But they also include many independence supporters who simply believe that now is not the right time to be opening up another wound. And the message I'm getting from people in Scotland is pretty clear. Try to make Brexit work, and please don't add to the uncertainty we're already facing. And this desire to put division behind us is something that I understand. Now, as you know, and as has previously been said, I fought hard last year to keep all of the UK in the European Union, and the result was and remains a tough one for those of us who believed it was in our national interest and in Europe's interest too to remain within a reformed EU. And if the Brexit vote was tomorrow instead of last June, I would still vote Remain, even knowing now all that has happened since. But I do believe that, the decision having been taken, we all have to put in a shift to try to make this work for all of us. Either we respect the votes in referenda or we do not. Either we respect democracy or we do not. And either we seek to deny reality or we seek to prepare for the new reality as best we can by ensuring that Scotland and the UK remain engaged with the heart of Europe, even if we are no longer to be seated at the EU table in Brussels. And most of all, I believe we should avoid to choose further instability and uncertainty. People don't want Brexit to be used to start yet another fratricidal conflict. Now, I don't want Scotland to join a post-Trump America and a pre-election France as this year's focal point for global instability. I want to contribute to the best deal for Britain outside of the EU, and I want to ensure that our negotiation proceeds as well as it can and is done as speedily as is possible. And most of all, I want Scotland to move away from the constitutional rabbit hole of the division as we've dwelt in these last 10 years and ensure that we're focused on achieving stability. Last week, Liz Cameron at the Scottish Chambers of Commerce summed it up rather nicely. If, she said, we allow ourselves to be drawn into the tunnel vision of Europe, we run the risk of missing the chance to transform Scotland's attractiveness as a place to do business. I think Liz is absolutely correct. We are in danger of falling prey to the idea that Brexit is such an important issue that everything else may as well be forgotten about. And it's an all too familiar story in Scotland, where constitutional conflict has often stopped us thinking about the more immediate and more pressing concerns. And I say we can't allow the grass to grow under our feet, because such an attitude will only mean that when Brexit comes, Scotland will be unprepared for the challenges that it will inevitably bring. What I believe we need, both in London and in Edinburgh, is a government that decides to take control of the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, any entrepreneur will tell you that a moment of change is a moment of opportunity too, and what we need right now is a government that has the spirit of the entrepreneur, a government that recognises the landscape in which it operates, is mindful of the possible pitfalls, but which also seeks out what opportunities exist. This is the better path for the SNP to choose, and I'm sorry that they do not appear ready to take it. Ever since the result of the referendum on June the 24th, the SNP stance has been set by whatever it thinks will increase support for independence or support for another independence referendum. Now, the problem is that the public has, as I say, proven stubbornly resistant to this plea, and I'm only sorry that in recent weeks the party appears to have decided in response to double down on their attempt to push for that second referendum. Now it's not just about Brexit. Now Mike Russell takes the airwaves to declare that we need a referendum to escape what he describes as an insular and inward-looking Britain. Indeed, if reports this week are to be believed, for the SNP hierarchy, it's no longer about staying in the EU at all. Instead, SNP sources are now proposing that an independent Scotland should exist in a no man's land, halfway between the UK and the EU, but part of neither. A position concocted purely to try and win back the many thousands of SNP voters who voted to leave the European Union too. And now, with support for a referendum falling off a cliff, the SNP is no longer saying that people should have the right to decide. Now Nicola Sturgeon says a referendum is something we all simply must confront. In other words, having failed to persuade people of the necessity of another referendum, the SNP is now hoping to soften us up by telling us we'll just have to accept one. It is the language of the bully pulpit. The attacks on the UK are grave distortions. It doesn't speak of a party that's confident of its case. It smacks of desperation, and I urge the SNP to take a different path. Or, to put it another way, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Now, I don't believe that we're helpless to act in the face of Brexit. And what's more, there are, frankly, so many more interesting things for us to talk about. Just imagine for a moment that Brexit had gone the other way last June. What now would be the dominant narrative in Scotland? It would, I suggest, be about the huge new powers that are coming to the Scottish Parliament in April and the questions that they throw up for us all. Something that will finally emerge into the public gaze later this week when Parliament will vote for the first time on the Scottish budget. This is what I consider to be the first authentic budget since devolution. Until now, the budgets have been more accurately simple spending plans. This year, it is different. And the SNP will have to weigh up both sides of the balance sheet. Of course, most of the attention is focused on the levels of income tax that the Finance Secretary has chosen to set. But arguably of far greater importance is the fact that finally the Scottish Government will have a real stake in the performance of our economy. From now on, the Scottish budget will depend on two factors. Around half will come from the block grant as determined by the Barnett formula, and the other half will come from the new devolved taxes, most notably income tax. The Fraser of Allender Institute has set out what it means. It says that Scotland's economic performance, or more accurately, our relative performance, will have a greater bearing on the spending plans of Holyrood than ever before. In short, if Scotland can achieve higher growth than the rest of the UK, we'll reap the rewards. This is something I know I need not explain to the audience in this room, but it is a fact that I fear is still not cutting through at Holyrood itself. Indeed, given the lack of debate, it's as if the new powers are not coming at all. My left-wing colleagues continue to rage against the inadequacy of the cheque from Westminster as they see it. And a cynic might suggest that a Tory bogeyman is a convenient scapegoat. Answers as to how we ourselves here in Scotland can boost public spending or return money to the taxpayers by boosting economic performance have so far been thin on the ground. So my goal this year is to, at the very least, start that new debate so that this country finally accepts that we have control and that we have the power to make defining choices on this country's future. And my contribution to that debate is to focus relentlessly on ways to increase Scottish growth. This is urgent because we are falling behind the rest of the UK, and that is no longer in dispute. Figures 2 weeks ago showed that the Scottish economy grew by just 0.2% in the third quarter of 2016. That reflected a longer-term trend. In the year to September last year, our growth rate was just 0.7% compared to a UK rate of 2.2%. Now, in the past, this level of growth could simply have been written off as a blot on our reputation for enterprise. But now under the new powers coming our way, it could end up actively reducing the amount of money that we are able to spend. So, as Fraser of Allender puts it, with new taxpayers coming on stream, it is vital that the gap with the UK is closed. The question is, how do we do that? So I would like to focus my remarks this evening on two key issues. One of them is long-term and the other short-term. The short-term measures refer directly to the tax proposals in this week's budget. And there are three key tax measures that are being proposed. The rate for the fledgling land and buildings transaction tax will be set, with buyers of larger homes paying higher sums than they would south of the border. The large business supplement has been doubled overnight, meaning firms with high rateable values are paying more than they would south of the border. And the SNP will not increase the threshold for higher rate taxpayers and will instead use fiscal drag to net ever more earners into the 40p tax bracket. This too will mean they pay higher taxes than they would elsewhere. And there is, I would suggest, a theme developing here. In short, if you aspire to buy a decent-sized home, to build a modest company or earn a decent wage, Scotland will penalise you accordingly. And my question is, how exactly is this going to help us close that economic growth gap with the rest of the UK? To be fair, on income tax, the gap between people in Scotland and the rest of the country will not initially be that large. By 2020, it will have grown to £800 a year. And it is this which has prompted some firms here in Edinburgh to suggest that in order to attract people to come and work here, they'll have to pay a Scottish supplement in order to convince them to do so. Now, this worries me. It worries me for the message that it sends. Come to work in Scotland, but pony up nearly £1,000 more than you would in Manchester or London or Bristol. And this is where, again, I have to challenge the Scottish Government. Regularly in recent weeks, it has sought to declare that Scotland is offering to be an open, welcoming country in marked difference to the rest of the UK. I simply suggest that asking workers or their employers to pay extra each year for the privilege of living here is not much of a welcome mat. Indeed, I fear it will send out the exact opposite message, and it will deter people from coming here. And the consequence of that is that we'll end up reducing the free movement of people from around the UK into Scotland instead of increasing it. And for all of these reasons, we will have no choice but to oppose this week's budget unless the SNP agrees to examine its tax proposals once again. We will do so because we believe that taxes here should not be higher than the rest of the UK, and where affordable, they should be lower. Because we believe that this is what will boost growth and add to the Scottish Government's coffers. Our own analysis has found that by simply increasing the proportion of higher and additional rate taxpayers in Scotland to the UK average would increase tax revenues to Holyrood by £600 million a year. Now, of course, that's not going to happen with a flick of a switch, but it just gives you an idea of the extra money that could be flowing into the Scottish Exchequer to be spent on our public services or returned to taxpayers if we were to put a rocket under our economic performance. As Andrew Wilson, the head of Nicola Sturgeon's Growth Commission, has suggested, How do we increase tax revenue in Scotland? How about doubling the number of additional rate taxpayers? This is possible, and there is no reason why we should not find consensus in doing so. Whisper it, but there are even areas where the SNP and we agree. On air passenger duty, for example, both of us are supporting a tax cut for the same reasons. We both believe that lower taxes here will increase traffic and add value to the Scottish economy. Specifically, we would target measures on APD at long-haul flights, because we think that would create new direct routes from Scotland to North America, to the Asian economies, and to other high-growth markets. I'm sure we and the SNP can reach an agreement here to ensure that this welcome tax cut happens. But what I find odd about the SNP's position is the lack of consistency. Because what's right for APD is also surely right for income tax and business taxes too. And I know that many SNP figures concur with this point. Indeed, they used to make the exact same arguments as I'm making here when they supported a cut in corporation tax just 2 years ago. Sometimes it seems that the SNP only wants to cut taxes that are currently in Westminster hands, all the better to complain when they aren't. But it's not good enough anymore. Scottish politics is now getting real, and there will be those, and Patrick Harvie is one of them, who take an honest approach to this on the other side of the argument. Now, I don't agree with Patrick, I don't agree with him one bit, but at least he has acknowledged the scope of the changes that are possible. And what I fear we will end up with the current regime is a government that is stuck somewhere in the middle of the highway, and we know what happens there. You get squashed. So unless the SNP makes substantial changes in the next couple of days to show that they're prepared to consider our proposals, we will be voting against their budget on Thursday. Now, there has been speculation that this may prompt another election given the parliamentary maths if they can find no other allies. We shall see. But if it does occur, and the government is unable to get its budget through, then it will have no one to blame but itself. Because we need a government with the boldness to set a course, to take control of these new powers, and that doesn't seem to be apparent right now. So if tax is the short-term, immediate changes that we would like to see, what about the longer-term reform? Well, I'd like to raise just one issue tonight, and that is the question of our education system and skills. I'd like to start with a visit I made yesterday which shows how to get things right. I went to Newlands Junior College in Glasgow. It's the brainchild of entrepreneur Jim McCall. It was set up 3 years ago with a specific remit to help 14 to 16-year-olds in Glasgow who are on the verge of dropping out of the education system. Instead, the college provides them with intensive vocational and personal training to give them the skills they need to get on in life. There are, Jim says, around 20% of our young people who fit this category who will leave full-time education with nothing to their name. After 2 years at his college, these young people are guaranteed an apprenticeship or a place at college. I met a number of them yesterday, and it was a complete inspiration to see how young lives are being turned around by a great idea that is being brilliantly implemented. The problem is that currently Newlands Junior College is a one-off. Jim McCall is hoping to expand across Scotland, and he's got plenty of support to do so. But in Scotland, rather than roll out the red carpet to innovation like this, instead the system is set up to frustrate and block it. As Mr. McCall said recently, there was a typically Scottish socialist response from some quarters. When you get down to actually doing anything, there are some people who believe any private sector involvement in education is wrong. More accurately, it is a bureaucratic response, a response that says the interests of the producer and its institutional survivor is more important than what works. I take several lessons from Mr. McCall's experience. Firstly, we need to end the one-size-fits-all shibboleth that has dominated our approach for so many years in Scotland and free ourselves up to new ideas and fresh thinking. The current approach is simply not working. If we needed proof of that, it came in the PISA statistics last year, which showed once again that Scotland is falling behind in the international league tables. And it's been followed up in evidence given to the Scottish Parliament in recent months, which has exposed the Byzantine level of interference and top-down inadequacy, which is afflicting our education system. In short, teachers are succeeding, and most of them still are, in spite of the system they are operating in, and not because of it. So as the Scottish Government prepares to unveil its governance review, we're calling for far more autonomy and more freedom for schools and colleges to help drive better standards, to encourage initiatives like Newlands Junior College, not to stifle them. The international evidence is there. These reforms will free teachers up to do their job. It will lead to an education system that takes responsibility for rising standards and doesn't seek to pass the buck. Secondly, investment does matter. Mr. McCall's college does not come cheap. In fact, it is just as well he's got a few spare million to keep it going. So we as a country need to commit to an investment in skills. That's why the Scottish Conservatives have called for extra investment in further education colleges to reverse the cuts overseen by the SNP, in part supported by our call for a graduate endowment. It's also why we've called for every penny of the new apprenticeship levy to go exactly where it is intended, to fund skills and apprenticeships. And thirdly, we should not give up. Even at the age of 16, there is a chance to steer a young person away from the dole queue or the criminal court and back into the workplace. This is why we've also proposed a new network of skills academies, similar to the junior college model, but for an older age group, to ensure that more young people get world-beating training in everything from IT to engineering to construction. Because this really matters. Most firms in Scotland expect to have more jobs available for higher level skills over the coming years. At the same time, about 2/3 of those firms are not confident about filling those high-skilled vacancies in the future. If we really are going to be Brexit ready by the time we leave the EU, we must turn this around. And the message is, it can be achieved. But we do need to take action, not sit back, declare that we're doomed, and await the worst. To conclude, this is a time when it's easy to give in to the belief that we're all running out of control. The ruptures we've experienced in the last 12 months, from Brexit to President Trump, have smashed aside the old certainties. And the question that's left hanging is, well, if that's possible, what else is coming round the corner? For Conservatives, our response to this must be to place a greater importance than ever on protecting institutions, on reinforcing the stability on which our prosperity and our security depends. Our belief is founded on the need for those strong institutions, and they've never felt quite so necessary as now. And I believe that this preference for stability and certainty over yet more flux and insecurity is also what most people of Scotland want too. And I know that opinion polls should be taken with a pinch of salt these days, but this weekend's polling revealed it fully. On the independence question, opinion in Scotland remains where it did in 2014. There is churn within the numbers, but Scotland stands where it was. The big change is the drop in the number of people who want that issue put back to the test. Barely a quarter say they want another early referendum, down from over 40% in the summer of last year. All politicians, unionists and nationalists, are now getting a firm instruction from the Scottish people. Yes, we have our views. Yes, we differ. But no, this is not the right time to rip things up again. Whether it is demanding yet another referendum on one side or proposing a UK-wide constitutional convention on the other, I see little appetite for more of the last 5 years. No appetite for adding to the uncertainty that we already face. And I believe now we must focus on the challenges that we have, not on adding to them. And that means facing up to the challenges on Brexit, the biggest public policy question this country has faced in a generation. But it also means action rather than paralysis, whether that's real or artificial. Scotland is not helpless in the face of the challenges. It has more political power to act now than it has ever had, to set a course for economic growth, to deliver the world-class education system that the next generation deserves, to equip our young people with the skills that we need in order for Scotland to prosper. We can take responsibility for this, or we can give in to the easy luxury of grievance and inaction. For my part, I hope very much over the next vital year that we set the former course. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Now, we've got quite a lot of time for questions, you'll be glad to know. I don't think they'll be backwards and coming forwards for some questions. Can I remind you, there are a couple of microphones hopefully roving around, so if you wish to ask a question, please wait on the microphone turning up. Please state who you are. Brevity is preferred in your questions. The late Tam Diel would have told you that a short question spears the speaker a bit easier than a very long question. So with that, do you want to do them one at a time, or shall we do two or three at a time? Two or three at a time, I think. Yep. Do we have any volunteers? There's not that many hands. There's a
I'll just head off
man
home,
there. Yep. Have the fun of, is the microphone working?
While we're waiting for the microphones to work, before I was elected politician, I was a journalist for 10 years, and I had the great pleasure of interviewing Tam Diel many times. And he may have been a fan of the short question, but by God, he gave long answers, let me tell you that.
It's a good combination. Have we got a working microphone now?
I'm delighted to hear a speaker take that lesson to herself. Can I also, first of all, thank you, Ruth. Sorry, my name is Bill Roger. I'm a member of European Movement in Scotland. Thank you, first of all, for campaigning for the right side during the referendum. If I can turn you to your talk, you started and you ended by saying we mustn't have a second independence referendum, which has been a refrain of yours since the European referendum. Does it not therefore concern you that Mrs. May, in her approach to the discussions with the devolved administrations, appears to be pushing, by virtue of intransigence, these administrations, or the Scottish administration in particular, towards a second independence referendum? And if it does concern you, how are you using your own good standing within the Conservative Party to advise her otherwise?
Thank you. Another question over on the left there.
Ruth, Jim Gallagher, thank you for that, which is good fun. And I agree with much of what you said about referendums. I'm sick of hearing about them, so I won't ask about them. But I will ask you about the other topic you raised, which is getting a budget through. Well, you're right, we're the first time we were having some excitement over the setting of the Scottish budget. So what will get you alongside the SNP? What do they need to do to get your support? Is it just that 800 quid for the income taxpayers? Or do you have any spending priorities? You sound like quite a cheap date at the moment, so maybe you should be asking for a bit more.
Charmer.
Dear. Do you want to start answering the silver-tongued charmer at £800?
I have to say, I usually expect to be taken out for a steak dinner before I let men talk to me like that. But no, if I do want to start with Jim's question about the budget, I mean, we made it clear to the Finance Secretary, and the meetings are ongoing. Murdo Fraser, my finance spokesman, and Dean Lockhart, our business spokesman, met with him and Keith Brown this morning in the latest rounds of negotiations ahead of Thursday. And we're pretty clear. You know, one of the red lines for us is that we don't want Scotland to become the highest tax part of the UK. That's not just income tax, it's also about land and buildings transaction tax, as I briefly mentioned in my speech, and also doubling the large business supplement. There is a reason why the economic data coming out of the rest of the UK and coming out of Scotland is going like this at the moment. There's a reason why that is affecting employment, why it's affecting unemployment, why it's affecting GDP, why it's affecting growth. And we think that we need to become a more competitive part, not just of the UK, but also of Europe. So we'll be taking a full part in those negotiations. Don't you worry, Jim. We've never counted ourselves out early. But, you know, we need a pretty serious rethink before we can go alongside them. Now, there's plenty of spending commitments that you've seen in terms of our manifesto that was published, you know, just 8-9 months ago, things about warm homes, things about increasing support for mental health within the NHS budget, loading primary care, actually doing some of the things that the Christie Commission identified years ago that have never been acted on, to make sure that we get the best bang for a buck in public services. But it is important, if we're going to fully and better fund our public services, that we have an economy that's able to do it, not one that's slowing down at the rate that it currently is. Bill, thank you very much for your thanks for my performance at the European referendum. It turns out it was about 4% not good enough, for which I apologise. I think in terms of the question, I actually don't believe that it was a fair question in the way in which it was framed, because if you look at what Theresa May has laid out in her 12-point plan of what she's hoping to achieve out of Brexit, there is an awful lot of what the SNP asked for in that, what the Scottish Government had already lobbied on. So things like protection for EU citizens living in the UK, that's in there at point number 6. Protections for workers' rights, that's there in part of the 12-point plan. Closer cooperation and continued cooperation on defence and security issues, including policing, that's in the 12-point plan too. The difference appears to be between the structure of what structure free trade occurs under, whether that is a free trade deal with the EU, which, as the Prime Minister has stated, she wants to see let me get the actual wording right. She wants the opportunity for UK businesses to trade as freely as they can, both within the EU 27 and to the EU, and their ability to operate within as well as sell to, or whether that's staying in an institution which is part of the deal that we're choosing to leave, or that the UK as an entity voted to leave. So no, I mean, I think that there is a lot of heated rhetoric going on at the moment. I think we're quite used to that in Scotland. I think that, or I would trust that people can see through it. But I think when you've got a First Minister that stood up the morning after the vote itself, before the last ballots had been counted, and said that she had already instructed civil servants to draw up the necessary legislation for a second independence referendum, you could see where she was going from the start. And in a sense, I would doubt that it ever mattered what the UK government did. She would still find a fault with it, because that's where she wanted to go. And she said as much inside Butte House on the 24th of June. But I mean, I really hope that, because this matters, it really matters, that I didn't want to leave the EU. That was not what I thought was the optimum future for the UK. But it's going to be bloody difficult to negotiate a good deal if all the different bits of the UK are fighting with each other and not putting their shoulder to the wheel. And I hope that we can end up having people put their shoulder to the wheel.
Okay, another couple of questions. There's one at the very back there.
Jamie Livingston from Oxfam. Thank you very much for an interesting speech. A key theme was the pursuit of economic growth. The IMF and the World Bank have made clear that extreme economic inequality is a barrier to economic growth, in addition, in our view, to reducing poverty. So given the Prime Minister's focus on those just about managing and the barrier that extreme economic inequality creates to inequality of opportunity, do you agree that the gains from growth need to be shared more fairly through, for example, measures to make work fairer? And if you do, will you ensure that the Scottish Government's upcoming Inequality Commission drives towards the use of those substantial new powers you talked about to help narrow the gap? Thank you.
Hi, Jamie. Yeah, I mean, I think you, like me, would welcome the fact that, and others like the Resolution Foundation welcome the fact that inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient is falling across the UK and continues to fall. And unlike other European nations, that is primarily driven by an increase at the bottom rather than a reduction at the top, which is what we all want to see. I think there have been measures that have been taken, particularly regarding taking people out of taxation, getting people who are unemployed and long-term unemployed back into work. But do I want to make sure that when some of the powers that are currently held elsewhere are passed to Holyrood, that Holyrood is ready to receive them and ready to use them in a way that helps the fact that we do have a stubbornly higher unemployment rate in Scotland than the rest of the UK's, to get more people back into work, to make sure that people are able to move through the bands, that people need to retrain are able to do so. And I don't think, and I mentioned it again in my speech, that I don't think cutting 150,000 college places helps people retrain, reskill and get into the workplace. That's one of the things that I want to see addressed. That will help, all the analysis shows that will help women more than men, who are still paid less than men. I've spoken before in the past in other forums about the idea that of looking at fairness within pay structures. You know, I don't think people in general mind that the CEO or the MD is the highest paid person in an organisation. I think what they mind that, you know, 20, 30 years ago, the CEO would be paid about 40 times more than somebody else. Now it can be more than 400 times more than somebody else in that organisation. That's what they mind. And there has to be ways in which we can look at having that kind of ethical policy. So, yeah, we're absolutely standing ready to play our full part, both within the Parliament and in our endeavour to help promote within the government this idea that it's important to get people back into work, to have fair work options out there, to have retraining options for people and to have skills options for them. And that's how you make the country move forward.
Jeremy Peach.
Jeremy Peat, now at Strathclyde International Public Policy Institute. Ruth, I totally agree with your emphasis on the need to see how we can construct a situation whereby the gap between UK and Scottish growth is diminished. And I totally agree with your emphasis on further education and skills development as one key component on that. But I'm frankly desperately worried about how we make progress when the existence of our trading relationships with Europe going forward are so uncertain, constituting 55 to 60% of Scottish trade out with the UK, and the position with the UK remains in the hands of someone I wouldn't trust as far as I could throw my dog. So we are stuck in a position where we need to raise productivity, and we need to do that by increasing investment and innovation and attracting foreign investment. But we're in a position where the uncertainties of the UK's relationship are so huge, and Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK, let alone the rest of the world, are even greater. So how can we construct a situation whereby the key issues that you raised of reducing the differential between our growth and that of the rest of the UK can become the centre of debate rather than the peripheral and neglected topic?
I think that the question regarding the stubborn sort of low productivity within the UK is one that has started to be discussed. I'm not sure how much of that has been discussed, particularly in a Scottish context, but I'd like to see it happen. And if there's anything that Strathclyde Institute of Public Policy could do to help with that, we would absolutely and certainly welcome it. There was an awful lot of strands in that question. You mentioned foreign inward investment to the UK. I think we also need to be able to know where we are. Now, the stats that the Scottish Government always run to are the EY survey on inward investment, and that talks about the number of deals that are done, but it doesn't actually talk at all about the values of those deals. It could be a £10 billion deal, it could be a £10 deal, and it's counted as one unit, if you like. I believe that the Treasury is undertaking some analysis work, not just for Scotland, but for the whole UK, but looking at it in nations and regions as well, which will actually give us a bit of a baseline so we can start to discuss this in a way that is informed, which I think would be of great help. I think in terms of export markets, there is much that we can do, as I've touched on in previous speeches, as we put in our manifesto and as we've talked about since. There is much in the Scottish Parliament and government's remit that we can do to help. So things like promoting SCDI, opening up new offices, being able to help get people into markets. There is also, when it comes to, when you talk about inward investment in the UK, I mean, we had figures out just last week that show that, our trade with the rest of the UK is more than 4 times more now than with the EU. I've previously and flippantly said, you know, if you stub your toe, you don't cut yourself off at the knee. And again, that's about the constitutional certainty that if you take that second independence referendum off the table, people are willing to set up in Scotland, knowing that it will be within the same regime as the rest of the UK and all of these other things. So I don't agree that there is nothing that we can do. Now, I do accept that there's lots that we still don't know and that we should kind of get our finger out and start looking at it in a more serious manner, because frankly, the shallow level of debate on this and analysis, I think shames us in the Scottish Parliament, because we've all been too busy talking about constitutional and identity politics.
At the front here.
Ben Thompson.
We've got a bet on what your question is, so I need to know just before you start whether it's where we go.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very, very good, and I agree with a lot of what you say, and I do think we've debated too much on constitutional issues. Look, assuming all the powers and budgets come back in a couple of years' time, a lot of the European budget relates to matters that are already devolved, so agriculture, fisheries, economic development, medical research. Do you see most of the powers that come back from Europe that have already been devolved to Scotland being passed through to Scotland? And if so, do we then not need some sort of direct relationship between Scotland for those powers that are already devolved in those areas and Europe? So, for instance, fisheries, should our fisheries policy, when it comes back, now be, as it's a devolved matter, be run from Westminster or run from Holyrood?
Sure. I owe Eddie Barnes £20 because he got your question almost exactly right on further devolution of powers, and it is a sensible question on the further devolution of powers. The UK government has said, and you know, I'm very pleased that they set out early that they're going to have a grown-up discussion with all of the devolved administrations about, first of all, the powers have to be repatriated to the nation-state from leaving the EU, the nation-state being the UK, which is the member state of the EU, and then a big grown-up discussion about what happens. I think what's important is that rather than being ideological, we're very practical about where the best place for those powers to lie is. Now, you mentioned specifically fishing. I've sat down with the head of the Fishermen's Federation, the White Fish Federation, the Pelagic Fleet, the NEFROP skippers, all of the people that are involved in that region. Now, they don't actually care what body makes the decisions, but what they're really clear about is that they want one regime for UK waters, because it makes no sense to them to have lots of different regimes for the 4 devolved nations, or for Scotland and the RUK or whatever. They are very clear in Scotland that that's what they want. They don't care if that power is held at Westminster. They don't care if it's some other body that decides it, but they're very clear that that's what it is that they want. And now, I think the question for policymakers is, do you then take an ideological view about that and have what nobody on the ground wants because of where it goes? So I think there's a lot of debate to be had with that, but do I see powers that are currently held at Brussels going to Holyrood after the repatriation? Yes, I do. Am I going to sit here and list them for you tonight before any of those discussions I've had? I would be a dafty if I did, and I'm not about to. But thank you for your question.
There's a question near the front here.
Hello, Tom Lamplugh, Scottish Government. I was just interested in your views in relation to if you could meet somebody from 2032, what would you ask them? And if you had absolute authority, what would you do?
Well, from 2032, I'd ask him for the Euro millions numbers before we leave. No, I mean, I think for me, the one thing that really matters, and in a sense, I think most people are shaped by where they come from, and you know, and the events within their own life, as well as, and I don't think you can get away from that when you're looking at policy making. And you know, my background's fairly well known. I went to a school in quite a socially depressed area in Buckhaven in Fife, which they've just knocked down, actually. And what I saw in that, it was a very big school, it had a school roll of over 1,500. And what I saw in there were kids that were bright but from poor backgrounds that weren't getting the opportunities that thicker kids who were richer could get elsewhere. And that to me is something that it doesn't matter what colour rosette you wear, you want to get right, because it's not just about their individual chances in life and the opportunities that they can create for any families that they go on to have, but it's also about what we can do as a country, because if you're letting your talent go to waste, if you're even, and my school was pretty good, but you know, even then there was a real inhibition of people's horizons. There was a real sense that you couldn't look beyond what you already knew. It wasn't that you could do anything. It was that there was stuff that wasn't for you, as well as stuff that you could do. And that's what I want to change. I want a kid, no matter where they're from, to think there's nothing that they can't do if they're good enough. And at the moment, right now, you've got people being told no. And I don't think that's good enough. And I think that's why, actually, yesterday's visit was really good. And there's, you know, I've come here before. I think the very first one of these lectures I gave about 4 years ago, I rather inelegantly said, not all children learn the same and they shouldn't all be taught the same. And, you know, as an English literature graduate, all of those negatives is terrible. I should give myself a big hearty slap for that. But it is true. And there are people out there that are wanting to try new things, not for the sake of it, but for the specific needs of the children that it will affect. So you've got a bunch of parents in Milngavie that want to keep St Joseph's Primary School going because they want a Catholic education for their children in a community school that represents their community that is being closed down, and they don't want their kids to have to be bussed miles away to a school where and split up from their cohorts. And they are absolutely able to do it, and they want to be able to set up and run that school themselves, and they have the ability to do it. And in other countries, they would be allowed to do it, countries both within and without the UK. And that's been sitting on somebody's desk now for 2 years. And you've got something like Newlands Junior Academy, which it has taken 8 years from Jim McCall saying he'd pony up the money and he would do this to look after kids who were already identified at 14 by their own schools, that they would leave school at 16 with nothing, with no certificates at no level, who were coasting, who were dropping out, who were not attending. And he would take them on and he would make sure that they had an educational outcome, whether that was further training within college or whether that was a job within an apprenticeship that they could go on and work. And he has had to fight every step of the way and has had a director of education in a council tell head teachers not to refer any children to his college that they thought they could help. You know, and it's that idea that we cannot try anything new to try and get better that I want to get rid of. Not everything will work, and we shouldn't use our children as experimentation, and I get all of that. But where things are shown to work, we should absolutely be able to muscle in behind it and give kids the absolute best chance, no matter where they're from, no matter what obstacles have been put in their way. That's what I want to do by 2032. Well, you also asked what if I had complete and total domination. That's what I would do with complete and total world domination, would be to have that, to engender that have a go idea rather than no you can't idea that we have too much in Scottish public policy. I think in terms of 2032, what would I ask them? I think I would ask them, how far can you go if you start in the pooring houses and if you start in the poorest housing estate in Scotland? How far can life take you? I think that's what I would ask.
Someone at the back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike Ash. There's an increasing recognition that the failures in social care have contributed to many of the pressures in the health service, and that's been recognised somewhat belatedly in England, I know. But it is noted that some Conservative politicians in England are now calling on their own local government resources and suggesting that they should raise council tax to make a significant injection into social care. Will you be proposing in your budget negotiations that there should be some other way of raising more money to invest in social care services that have been depleted in Scotland, as they have been depleted in England for many years?
Well, I think in terms of the English policy to which you refer, it's already in implementation. It's called the Social Care Precept, and you have an ability within a local authority area to raise council tax by up to 3% and ring-fence that money to spend on social care. I think the difference between social care up here and down south is that we're already in the process, and this has been a cross-party process that has enjoyed support from all sides of the chamber, of combining the NHS and social care budgets. And we're now quite some way down the road to that. And part of the issue in terms of the ability for money to go further and to be able to help the people that need help is that quite often there were silos that were developing between what is an NHS responsibility and what is responsibility within a local authority budget, and people not wanting to help with that. So, for example, if a local authority didn't get its finger out and put in the aids that somebody that needed to come out of hospital, whether that was a ramp for their house or a walk-in wet room because they weren't able to clean themselves because of some medical issue, that meant that they then couldn't be released from hospital. So it's designed, and that costs everybody more money, that costs society more money, as well as leaves the poor person in a hospital bed for longer than they need to be when they can be back in their own home. So it's designed to iron that out. And in terms of making sure that it happens and people aren't just still jealously guarding budget, there are combined sort of groups across local authority and health board areas that are working to make sure that that happens and it eases out. Now, we don't have all the data from that. We have started that process. It's continuing. I think that it's a way forward that should be supported. We as a party supported it. I know it's now being looked at down south and they're a bit behind us in this way, but we'll begin to get the data from that in quite short order, and perhaps if I'm invited back next year we can have this conversation and we might have the data to be able to discuss it.
We have down the very front here.
Thank you very much for a nice and interesting talk. Dr. Stephen Watson, mathematician from the University of Glasgow. I want to sort of link the question that I got just behind me to in some way one of the themes of your talk. So I'm going to sort of quote some of the things you said. You wanted to talk about boosting economic growth. You talked about we have control. In fact, you talked about huge new powers. So with that in mind, those claims, I want to focus on the link between the economy and the educational sector. In particular, how we might support education, raise productivity, and promote innovation. And I want to explore that in the context of the post-study work visa. So the question for you would be, because you're arguing that Scotland's in an incredibly powerful position in relation to these Brexit negotiations, and it can choose to somehow execute its leverage to maximal effect. And to sort of link it to a talk that happened at Glasgow, Lord Kerr's talk, Brexit, is the train crash avoidable? And for those who don't know, Lord Kerr wrote Article 50, so the talk was not alarmist, it was quite a reflective talk. The discussion around post-study work visas was a question of the suspension of disbelief. Because as many will know in this room, the post-study work visa was part of the Scotland Bill. In fact, it went from the Smith Commission to the Scotland Bill. It was an amendment to the Scotland Bill that was supported by every political party in Scotland and, of course, by Universities Scotland. And it was refused as an amendment. It was declined. Now, like you, I also have a bet on this question, on your answer. So I'm going to let you speak to what the post-study work visa says, and then I have a follow-up remark, which is very brief.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think, you know, there was disappointment across Scotland that the post-study work visa wasn't implemented. I think there is a wider issue too, though, and I don't know if this comes into your £20 bet or not, but we in Scotland have a third of the UK's land mass. We have 8.4% of the UK's population. We get 4% of people who emigrate to the UK coming to live and work in Scotland. Why are we so unattractive, not just for students, but for workers too? I think that we have many questions to ask ourselves regarding attractiveness to to people from outside the UK. I also think that we've got a number of questions to ask ourselves about competitiveness within the UK. I know that in the context of Brexit, there's a lot of discussion, and it's been framed by the Scottish Government on, it's called their differentiation strategy, this idea that there must be a differentiated deal for Scotland. And there is a complete level of non-acknowledgement that there will be a differentiated deal, but that it's not on geographical grounds, which is the only grounds they seem to want them, but it's on sectoral grounds. So I've never had explained to me why a soft fruit farmer in Perthshire, who may require people to be able to go there on a seasonal work visa, has a different set of needs than a soft fruit farmer in Kent, who also needs people to go there on a seasonal work visa. Now, the sectoral issue there in negotiating Brexit is what is it that the country needs? Similarly, I don't understand, and I've never had explained to me by the Scottish Government who's making this argument, that the only differentiation that needs to happen is on geographic grounds, and the post-study work visa would come into that too. That why somebody who's working in an office for RBS in financial services in Edinburgh, their job needs something different that somebody doing the same job for RBS in financial services in the city in London. It's about that sectoral differentiated deal rather than the geographic one. Did you win your money?
Kind of. So the punchline, for those who are not aware of it, is that the UK government, subsequent to declining post-study work visas in Scotland, within Scotland's universities, recently, and that would be of August, September last year, awarded it to Oxford, Cambridge, I think it was Imperial,
Pilot
and also
projects.
Bath. It's called Pilot, but of course, what's interesting is that no Scottish university, for example, let's take the University of Edinburgh where we sit, was identified within this so-called trial. And so, of course, there is an interesting question there. Is Scotland's university sector not sectorially strong enough to be considered for this? That's in some way the pushback. Can Scotland actually find itself supported in the way that it feels it needs? And this is also a democratic remit. If every political party in Scotland feels this way, if every institution and university feels this way, why wouldn't that be sufficient for the UK government to concede post-study work visas to? It's a puzzle for me as you consider wider issues.
Sure. I've had this discussion with Tim O'Shea and Charlie Jeffrey at Edinburgh University, and you asked in your original question if I'd made any representations on this. Well, I have. I think it is wrong that if you're going to run a pilot project for 4 universities, none of those universities are going to be north of Birmingham. So I have made that representation on behalf of Scotland, and if this pilot project is extended or it's brought through, then I want Scottish universities, at least a Scottish university, to be involved in that. So yeah, I absolutely take your point on the pilot project, and it would have been good if there had been a university at least north of the Watford Gap that had been involved in it as well. So yeah.
A small forest of hands suddenly went up over there. There's a lady at the end that looked desperate to ask you a question on this subject, I think, or related anyway.
No, on a quite different subject. My name is Anne Packard. At a recent Royal Society of Arts conference, John Glenn of Buccleuch quoted statistics from the Fraser Allender Institute about the impact of migrant labour and seasonal labour and the possible future absence of it on economies, say, of Dumfries and Galloway. What is your position, and what persuasion can you bring to bear on that question relative to tourism and agriculture and seasonal labour?
Okay, I have to admit and confess to not having seen that Fraser Allender report, so I'm not entirely sure to the statistics that you refer. However, right. I figured from the tone of the question that it wasn't a wholly positive Fraser Allender Institute report. I'd caught up with that part. I wasn't going to refer to the actual numbers because there's a professor of mathematics that's just asked a question, so I'm being on my best behaviour as it comes to numbers. But yeah, again, this is again coming back to what are going to be the future needs of the country. Obviously, one of the red lines, one of the views that has been taken is that those people that voted to remove the UK from the EU did so in part on the grounds of free movement of people. Because part of our immigration policy has been held at a European level, although obviously there's for outside of the EU 27. There have always had to be policies that were created here. But Brexit is going to mean that we start having quite difficult, I think, but incredibly necessary conversations about immigration, about need, about practicalities that in many ways we've not had for some time since a number of countries that were closest to us were in an arrangement with us wherein, there was no decision to be made. People came, left, etc. We had a small flurry of conversation and debate around the time that we had some accession countries like Romania and Bulgaria. But actually, it wasn't very deep at all. It certainly wasn't meaningful. And it was more, I believe at the time, based less on country need than on political expediency, if I'm honest. So I think when it does come to an examination of what happens, and I know that not just myself, but people across governments in the devolved nations, the UK government, in all of the different offices of states, from BAYS, I think we call it now, to the Treasury, to the individual Northern Ireland office, Scotland office, Wales office, etc., have been sitting down with all of these interests to say, what is it that you think the challenges are? What is it that you're afraid of? And what is it that you see the opportunities are for your sector, if you think there are any? There have been huge representations made, both from NFUS, NFU Cymru, the Northern Ireland equivalent, also Food and Drink Scotland, from all of these areas. So there is a pulling together of what it is that we're going to need, and then how we make that happen. I think the issue we've had before is that it's simply not been discussed to a certain degree within our immigration policy, and now it has to be. And we have to take the heat and light out of that and look at the needs of the nation.
At the front here.
Hello, Sam Hall. I was just wondering what your opinion is on a universal basic income in terms of kind of encouraging a can-do attitude and entrepreneurship and all that.
I'm not sure even the people that have promoted a universal basic income have said that it would engender a can-do attitude and entrepreneurship. However, I'd quite like to see it in action. I believe that people have proposed that Fife is a hotbed testbed for it. I'm not entirely sure how you disconnect the economy of Fife from everyone else, having grown up there. But, it's not a policy that I support or promote. I'm always willing to look at any data or evidence that is there. But it's not entirely sure that it is demonstrable that it would increase either the productivity issue that Jeremy raises, the GDP issue, or indeed, even in the long term, the issues of inequality that Jamie raised at the back.
There's a man in the fourth row that's desperate to ask a question.
Ian Ritchie with the David Hume Institute. Ruth, you're, I think, seen as a radical in the Conservative Party. I suspect in the UK you're seen as somebody who's very successfully brought the Conservative Party back to life in Scotland with new ideas. As a professional politician, how do you feel in the world today when professional politics is being attacked? I'm sure you were a great ally of David Cameron. He was summarily dismissed, largely because he was a professional politician. But we've just seen in the States the complete disposal of the political system. The Labour Party doesn't seem to want political skills anymore. What is going on, and why? And maybe it's something to do with the way we're run. The country is very centralist. It's not federal. It's not organised very well. We've got a second chamber that's outrageously appointed instead of elected. There's so much wrong with our system, and the public is saying we can't take this anymore, and they're not voting for it. I mean, you might be okay here in Scotland right now, but the message is coming through loud and clear that politics is not working.
Well, I think in terms of the start of your question, sadly, I'm not just a politician. I'm also, I was a journalist, then a politician. So I think I've only got tax collector and traffic warden until I've got the sets. So my mother's very proud. But no, I mean, I think there is an issue of trust. There is an issue of what we expect of our elected representatives. There's an issue of the standards they set themselves. I'm pretty old-fashioned. I'm kind of conservative with a small c as well as a big one, and I actually believe in old-fashioned notions of things like service. I actually think that it is a service that you should approach it as if it is a service that you wish to carry out and to do. I think there are fairly wide questions that are not confined to this country or even the English-speaking world when you talk about the collapse of Labour. I think there's a fundamental question about what political parties that are born out of the organised labour movement are for in a post-industrialised age. And I think I don't think anybody's answered that yet. And I think that you see things like the rise of Podemos and Syriza as linked in with that. I think the anti-politics movement in some ways, even if it shows people running to a right-of-centre populist or a popular nationalist in some countries, is a reaction to that. And I think as well, there's also a community of the angry that never used to exist. I mean, like I say, I was a journalist for over 10 years before I got elected, and we still joked about green pen letters, and occasionally they would actually come in green pen. Now there's email for that. But there's also the level of fury that exists in social media platforms, from anonymised eggs calling you all of the, names under the sun. And these people that used to feel isolated now feel that they've got a gang out there. There is this echo chamber where also people don't challenge. I think I've been on Twitter for about 8 years now, and I've yet to have any view on anybody's timeline of somebody saying, do you know, you make a good point, let me go away and think about that. And even in the days where you used to have the kind of furious sort of 2 a.m. debate after you've retired from the pub, you would actually listen to people as well as just state a bold black case as somebody else stated a bold white case, and you talked at each other and never to each other and never engaged. And one of the reasons, actually, that I left journalism and came into politics is because I believe in debate. I believe in the creativity of clash, and particularly for somebody having grown up in Scotland at the time that I did, as a Conservative, and having seen the two big parties being left of centre parties, one that believed in independence and one that didn't believe in independence, but almost all other things, there was barely a fag paper to put between them. There was this kind of soggy consensus, and you didn't have that challenge, you didn't have that clash. And there is a creativity that's involved in that. And I think a lot of people talk, and you spoke about David Cameron and others that have always been in politics, whether that's as bag carriers and then policy wonks, and then they've gone off to a think tank for a year and then come back or whatever. There is a sense that people don't have differing experiences, and there is a homogeneity about the way in which people arrive at events or positions that has left people that don't come from the same background as them behind. And I think, particularly if you look at the UK example of the Labour Party, it didn't know where its voters were on something like Brexit, until quite late on. And it didn't know where its voters were on issues like immigration. It didn't know where its voters were, and it hadn't engaged on that front for a long time. This is a very long and very rambling and very Tam Dalyell way of saying that I still think that there's a role for elected representatives. I still believe in representative democracy. After 2 referenda, frankly, I could do without direct democracy again in my professional lifetime. I believe that people are mostly in it for the right reasons, and certainly my colleagues in Holyrood, no matter, I might disagree with people vehemently on different issues, but most people are in it for the right reasons. We might have different ways we want to go about it, but we're pretty much all there because we want to make things better in Scotland. Now, what we see that as being and how we see the road to get there may be different, but we're pretty much all in the same place. And I do see an issue, a real issue, if the fury kind of continues. Actually, the number of people that want to be able to take that on and to grow that thick skin and to live with that level of abuse will decline, and the number of people that want to put themselves forward for public service will decline. And there may be an issue then, if people don't have a choice of good folk to vote for, then we're all kind of a bit in trouble. For my own part, I actually think in Scotland we're relatively well served by the calibre of politician that we have. I mean, I disagree wholly with Nicola Sturgeon on so many issues, but that's a woman who's very driven, who makes sure that she's well prepared, that works hard, puts in hours. I would like to think that I'm all of these things. I have a healthy respect for her professional abilities. I hope she has a healthy respect for mine. I think particularly when I look at the calibre of Conservative MSP that got elected in May, we come from all sorts of different backgrounds, some hugely highly professional. Your former colleague who held the chair of public law at Glasgow University, Professor Adam Tompkins at one end, people that have spent entire lives working in different sectors, be that agriculture, be that waste management, be that environmental background, be that lawyers, be that teachers, be that a retail manager that started off working on the till at Marks and Sparks and got up to, you know, being a kind of deputy regional manager who'd come up from a completely different route. These are people who wanted to put themselves forward to serve and gave up quite a lot to do it. And I really hope that we don't see such a lack of trust, that there stops being an idea that while folk might get things wrong, there's still good people that are trying quite hard to get things right.
Your Tamdale answer leaves us with only time for a Tamdale question. So put your hand down if you can't make it one line long. There's a man at the side there that's going to ask a very short question.
There we go. Would you hold hands with Donald Trump?
Oh, I wondered when we'd get asked. You want a short answer as well?
I don't know if he'd be fazed by the size of my hands, actually. I find it unlikely that I would be put in a position where I would have to find out. And that is the most politician answer you'll hear this evening.
I think that's an appropriate point at which we wish to stop. And an appropriately short question. Can I ask Professor Stuart Reid from the Young Academy of Scotland to say a few words?
Okay, thank you. Learned a lot there. One surprising thing I learned was the number of people who appear to make bets in this room about what people would ask and say. So hopefully no one made bets about what the Young Academy will say. But to begin with, I will be predictable. The only thing that stands between me and the reception outside, or the only thing that stands between you and the reception outside is me. And anyway, so I just take this opportunity to say a few words about the Young Academy of Scotland. We're co-sponsors of this lecture series, and it's thanks to the generosity of Ray and the wider David Hume Institute team that we have the chance to just share a few words. Perhaps you've been along to similar lectures to this before, and you know a little bit about what we do, so I won't bore you with all of the details of our mission statement, goals, and objectives, but I'll just highlight a few things that we have done. So we're a group of people, depending who we're speaking to, depends whether it makes sense, calling ourselves the Young Academy. Sometimes I call ourselves the Not-So-Young Academy, especially when we're speaking to schools. But we're a group of people who seek to collaboratively work together, try to inform public policy and support the Scottish society in any way we can, particularly through our research and our practical experiences. And that's been cemented through a recent creation of a working group within our body called the Knowledge and Power Working Group. We're made up of a variety of people: medics, historians, civil servants, engineers, social scientists, physical scientists of all kinds, members of the business community and industry in Scotland. And there are a multitude of different activities. I don't have time to go through them all. I just highlight a couple of things. Our Computing in Schools group have recently, or last year, ran the first LEGO League Challenge Schools Robotics Tournament. Last year, hopefully because of this, we saw the first Scottish team win. This is the West Linton Wasps from West Linton Primary School. They were crowned the UK and Ireland's first LEGO League champions. They went on to compete in the US, and we're hoping for similar successes in the coming year. Second activity that I'll draw attention to is our ongoing work on the silent histories, led by our Arts and Humanities group, which seeks to inform public debate using the first-person stories of migrants and refugees. These include the narratives from the Irish fleeing famine, Kinder transport evacuees escaping the Holocaust, Somalia refugees fleeing civil war, and more recently, voices of Syrians seeking refuge here in the UK. The Young Academy created a film and an education package which gets sent out to schools and for young people to help us better grasp the ways in which migration to Scotland in all of its forms is far from novel. And separate to this, but on a similar topic, last year we also launched our At-Risk Academics and Refugees Intake Programme, where we appointed 4 new members to our body from that grouping. We will also, in this May, Scotland Young Academy will be hosting the General Assembly of the Global Young Academies, that's academies from across 58 countries, spanning across the north and south of the world. And our focus in that meeting will be on social justice and inequalities, and so there'll be more to come from that. I would encourage you, if you have if you want, to follow us on the various outlets which we post our news on. So that will be on our web pages and also Twitter and Facebook. We're always keen to collaborate with new bodies, so if there's anything that you believe that you could link with us and partner with us to help in our strategy at facilitating for a better Scotland in the future, then we'd be really keen to hear from you. And so I'll just finish by saying a huge thanks to Alan Watson for chairing, and also for Ray and the DHI team for organising this, and finally to Ruth Davidson. So thank you.
I think we better let you go now. There are some drinks outside, I believe.